Hey! Still not Tiffany. On today's show, Ferrari axes the Lusso, Rolls-Royce upgrades the Ghost, and someone built the best Civic ever. Plus, we talk to the man who conquered Pikes Peak in a Tesla. I'm Cameron Neveu, and this is Hagerty's Daily Driver. Buckle up. All right, so you've got to give Ferrari credit. They've resisted building an SUV for so long. They even built a car that was supposed to be like an SUV, but wasn't. The all-wheel drive GTC4 Lusso, formerly known as the FF. Now the Lusso is an attractive four-seater in something that looks like a shooting brake shape. The hope was it could fill in for crossovers and SUVs that competitors like Porsche were selling like pints at Oktoberfest. Alas, Ferrari recently saw the writing on the wall and will soon announce an SUV, which means the GTC4 Lusso is toast. While not the fastest Ferrari ever built, its unique all-wheel drive system and glorious 6.3-liter V12 will be missed. RIP. And speaking of ghosts, Rolls-Royce has a new one. The Ghost is the entry-level Rolls-Royce sedan, assuming your idea of entry-level is dropping $250,000 on a car. Now BMW owns Rolls-Royce, and the current iteration of the Ghost is based partially on the 7 Series sedan. This has maybe irked some who didn't feel like spending 3 times as much on something with such proletariat roots, even if Rolls claimed only 20% similarity between those two vehicles. No more. The new Ghost is based on the brand's architecture of luxury platform, which also underpins the Phantom and the Cullinan. The company calls the design post-opulent, and it's supposed to eschew superficial expressions of wealth. You know what would be a good way to start eschewing superficial expressions of wealth? Maybe just buy a Toyota Camry or literally almost any other car. This new Ghost brings over the brand's 6.75-liter twin-turbo V12 and all the luxury goodies you could want. The twinkly starlight interior that lights up the cabin in the current model is now available on the passenger's dashboard. And get this, if you're so wealthy that your arm muscles have entirely atrophied, then you can merely pull on the door handle and it'll automatically open for you. And of course, the vehicle offers a microfiltration system to presumably filter out allergens, pathogens, or just the stench of the unwashed masses. What the new Rolls doesn't have is a mid-mounted VTEC V6, but our next car does. No, it's not an NSX, it's actually a Honda Civic. Specifically, it's an '84 Civic hatch in the style of a Renault R5 Turbo. Gone are the rear seats, and in its place is a 3.2-liter VTEC V6 from an Acura CL Type S, connected to a 6-speed transaxle from that same car powering the rear wheels. Beside the awesome sound, you could probably tell that this is something special by those big steel boxed flares, Enkai salad shooter wheels, and that big duct in the hood. The car is the work of hot rodder Andy Barczyk and has appeared in numerous magazines. It's currently for sale on Bring a Trailer with a couple of days to go, and trust me, don't wait for the Ghost. Buy this one now, save some money, and be happy forever. Coming up, our own Philip Thomas will talk to Blake Filler, the man who just won the exhibition class at Pikes Peak in a Tesla Model 3. But first,
you only need one key for a Honda. Simple. It works on the hatch, it works on the gas cap, and the Honda runs on low lead, no lead, or regular gas. Simple. It works on the door, and it works on the ignition either side up. You see, at Honda, we feel that the key is simplicity.
So my name is Philip Thomas. I'm a contributor to Hagerty. This is the Daily Driver, and we're talking to Blake Fuller, the Pikes Peak exhibition class champion, who finished in a completely stock Model 3. So Blake, tell us a little bit about the week and kind of what you ran into, and what did you learn from your previous attempts with a Tesla on the hill?
Yeah, so this year for 2020 at Pikes Peak, we were competing in the Tesla Model 3 Performance, and you are correct. It was a bone stock car with the exception of safety equipment, the R888R tires from Toyo, as well as we had some NRS brake pads on there because obviously you need a little bit more braking capability, some fluid, and outside of that, just safety equipment. And so we did have some lighter weight wheels from Martian Wheels, but ultimately our car was a representation of what somebody can go down to the showroom and buy. In fact, our car represents what would be considered a used car from Tesla, because ours was a 2018 model with 28,000 miles on it that we actually drove out from Florida with all of our gear in it to be able to compete at this year's hill climb. So it was a pretty big contrast from a lot of the other teams in our class that had trailered their cars out. As a matter of fact, I think save one other car, ours was the only car that actually had a street legal plate on it and could actually be driven on the road.
Pretty wild. And from your last program with the GoPuck Tesla, what did you guys kind of learn through that process? Because you guys worked on that car for what, 2, maybe 3 years?
Yeah, so the 2016 we competed with a late production 2015 Model S P90DL, and at that point, that was, I mean, even though it's just 4 years ago, there was really only one other Tesla Model S in the world that anybody we're aware of was even trying to turn into a race car, which was an actual racing series that was taking at first the P85 and then transitioned to the P90 or P100DL and caged them to try to set a circuit racing setup. But it was such early days that we really had no information, no data. It wasn't like we were running a BMW or Porsche and we could call up already existing teams or even learn from the internet as to how to set up a car. So that Model S, we came out for a paid practice 2 weeks earlier for Pikes Peak to be able to really see what the limits of the car were, and not necessarily the handling limits or the braking limits, because those are items that are pretty easy to kind of vet out. It really was the thermal limits of the entire drivetrain. You know, when you talk electric vehicles with people, the first thing is, well, do you have enough battery to get to the top? Well, the simple answer is absolutely. Both the Model 3 and the Model S could easily go to the top of Pikes Peak at typical speeds multiple times, and at race speeds, at least 2.5 times, both cars can make it to the top. So it's not the battery power, it's the capability of delivering that, what I consider to be kind of gut squishing acceleration that Teslas are known for, being able to utilize that full amount of torque at the entire run. It's sometimes I call it the longest 12 miles to get up Pikes Peak, because it is it's a lot more than 12 miles. Matter of fact, you know, some of the classics guys who are in the classics will know that about 20 years ago there was somebody who made a pretty famous quote that a single run at Pikes Peak is like 1,000 miles on the highway as far as the wear on a car. So it definitely is something where that testing that we did helped us kind of understand what the capabilities of the car were, so that when it came to race day, which again, you only get one chance to run the full mountain, and that is on race day. Every other time it's cut up in these little segments. You know, it's like saying, oh yeah, I can eat everything at the buffet, when all you've done is just eat a third of it each time. It's a pretty big statement, right? So that's really what we did with the Model S, was testing. So understanding the limits of that car, the Model 3 raises those limits, but yet it's still not at the point where you can go full throttle the entire way, which is evident because neither myself nor Randy Pokes, who also was racing a Model 3, and both of us finishing within just seconds of each other, neither of us could run full throttle the entire time.
So let's talk about a little bit about the war of attrition at Pikes Peak, right? You bring up a good point that electric cars have a small advantage because they're more consistent over the climb. Yes. So you have obviously a previous class win in open wheel, correct? Like 1999?
Yeah, so actually it was the open class. So it is a little confusing because they have those classes. Open wheels are the ones that are literally open wheel. The open class is typically a unibody car that is pretty heavily caged with a tied-in cage that can strengthen the cage. But the open class means that you can do a lot more modifications to that vehicle. Now, this year, I think the open class rules extended a little bit further because we saw some NASCAR-derived vehicles in there. But when I ran open class, it did have to have some portions of a unibody. It couldn't necessarily be a full tube frame. But yeah, so it was an open class win in 2002. And that's a pretty big gap from 2002 to 2016. It's 14 years to try to remember 156 turns. So it was
back then too.
Driver development, right?
So the bigger question I wanted to ask though is, what is the driving experience for you like, going from a previous win with a gasoline vehicle, which has its effects at high altitude, versus an electric vehicle, which is a little more impervious to that, right?
Yeah. So the differences are that, and the car that I won in 2002 was a forced induction car. It did have a supercharger on it, which is not quite as compensating as a turbocharged car at altitude. The turbocharged car will still try to maintain a fixed level of boost. A supercharger car, because it's belt driven, or in our instance it was belt driven, in other instances it might be chain or direct drive. Those vehicles typically will still have a better performance at altitude than a naturally aspirated, but you're still going to lose between 5 to 20%, depending on how well it's tuned from, the sea level to the 14,000 feet top end. And you really can feel the vehicle start to struggle, especially as you get above 10,000 feet. A car that typically might make 250 horsepower at sea level will make somewhere in the high 100s at the finish line. So, but on the counterpoint, at that particular area, it's not trying to struggle thermally. You do have a little bit less air, so you're not going to get as much air through the radiator. But because it's not producing as much peak power, your actual thermal mass isn't driving it to where you have to slow down too much. It's really, you are full throttle the whole time. Whereas with the battery electric vehicle at this point, we have enough fuel in the tank per se, but we have to make sure that we're not overheating some of the connectors or contactors or even the motors themselves. We're right on that cusp of being able to do a full Pikes Peak run at full throttle, but yet the vehicles are not yet capable to do that in street format. Keep in mind, our gas-driven cars that go up there and compete that are production-based, they have close to 100 years of engineering for thermal behind them, whereas the battery electric vehicles have about a 10-year spread. So there's some room for improvement there.
One of the rumors I heard years ago was that some of the more big name EV teams at Pikes Peak, say like Monster Tajima, Reese Millen, were kind of sitting out because their battery packs had kind of reached the end of their lifespan and they're waiting to invest into newer chemistries. So you mentioned lithium iron phosphate, which has come up in popularity recently. What is kind of the path forward, do you think, for a Pikes Peak application? Like if you had your dream budget, what would you build?
It's interesting when we're talking about a small lightweight pack, derivatives from the lithium iron phosphate have really good peak performance versus their weight, but they don't offer a great deal of capacity. So if we're looking at something that was in a Model 3 size, instead of having a 300-mile range, you might have a 220 to 230-mile range if optimized on a regular street form, but you'd still have that same peak power. You would possibly have longer cycle life. There's a lot of silicon-based derivatives that are coming out now that are coming in the 21700, as I call it, but a lot of people call it 2170s, which is a little bit different form factor cylindrical cell. If you said what's the ultimate, there are some military batteries out there that are utilized that are both in pouch form and in cylindrical, and there are some batteries that are used in UAVs that have just incredible potential, but they don't have very big cycle life. And if you're talking about racing, I mean, let's be honest. There's a lot of the cup cars and others that have 100-hour rebuild time, right? So they're not looking at thousands of cycles of, if in the battery world, it's not like, oh, I've selected this battery because it's going to last 10 years. No, they want it to last 10 minutes. That's it, right? So when it comes to teams that are running unlimited, it comes down to testing and budget, and then it still comes back to the reliability of them being able to take something that they can test and test and test, and it's not degrading quickly, And that's, I think, where Tesla's strong suit is, that they have found a really nice mixture of a product that performs well day in, day out on the streets. And I mean, candidly, my Model S P90DL now has over 50,000 miles on it, the one that I competed at Pikes, and we still take it out to Sebring and run it around. And, it's about 8% battery degradation, but when you think about it, it's 50,000 miles to have 8% wear gone. That's great. That's not much at all. For a battery that's
Go ahead.
No, for a battery that's 5 years old, 8% is negligible.
Here's the last major question I have, and this can apply to Pikes Peak or any other form of racing. But one of the most unique things I kind of gathered from driving a Tesla was you have to change your perception of speed, right? You don't have an engine here anymore or a transmission gear to align to a speed. You have to use other forms of sensory input. And you also have to take into consideration the effect of the, it's a little too early for me, but the regen braking. So that can be played into how the vehicle is controlled, because you can do regen braking on the front and rear axle independently in some instances. I don't know for stock car, but so how do you reapproach this effect of driving a car when your sensory inputs have changed so much and the whole dynamic is a little bit different?
Yeah, I think that being what I consider to be the first of growing up as a generation with Gran Turismo and video games, I think that really has helped me. Where you're missing certain sensory inputs when you first grow up playing. I mean, I'd go back to Commodore 64 playing Test Drive, right, with 3 keys. But I mean, at that point, you have no tactile feedback. You only have visual and audio. And so the Model 3 actually, yes, you remove that intense audio and that intense tactile feedback from the vibration, but with it, you are still given a lot of other type of tactile feedback that you get from the vehicle dynamics and movement. And that same type of anticipation in a virtual game is the same type of anticipation you need in the real game with the Model 3. And being able to multitask with the screen, where you can change not only the regen capability as far as its intensity, but also its should I say, not only power distribution on acceleration, but also on deceleration or regen, those dynamically change the vehicle handling. So even during our record run, I made about 4 adjustments on the vehicle on the fly, which was wonderful to have, which we didn't have in the Model S. Keep in mind, the Model S, we had a lot more movement in what we could do with the caster, camber, and toe of the car, because from the factory, it had air suspension as well. So we could actually set up the car for a pretty good corner weight, as well as a kind of a roll center front to rear to get it to turn in the way that I wanted. But once we had that set, there was really nothing I could do with the Model S. It was really just trying to keep it right below its stability control limits to maximize the time. In the Model 3, I could crank the stability control almost all the way off. I mean, it's said it's turned off, but believe me, it's still there. And it gets a little hairy-carry when you have a car that's a couple hundred pounds lighter in stock, and it's actually a little bit higher than your stock ride height, and you've added a lot of grip and stickier, brake pads with a different coefficient. The system's a little bit not sure of itself yet what to do. So in that, on race day, basically I had a gnarly understeer push almost going straight off in like turn 3. And after that, I'm like, okay, well, we'll keep this kind of dynamic understeer push through the lower section to get some heat in the tires and keep it stable. But as soon as I started getting into what I kind of consider the climbing sections past engineer and into picnic ground, then we can dial a little bit more rear bias and also change the amount of regen to be able to give the car a good turn in and to be able to power it out of the corner without wasting too much energy. So there's a lot to it. It's like a video game, man. Like I love playing Gran Turismo growing up, where I'd go into the settings and change that, and I'd race my Ghost. I mean, that's the one thing I'm missing, is having a Ghost to race against out here, where you're so you have to kind of, and that was the hard thing on race day. Is on race day, unfortunately, both of my timing equipments didn't automatically populate. So I was literally like racing a figment of my imagination as opposed to a clock. Whereas I was expecting, okay, I'm going to see my clock, and I'll be at this point in engineers, I'll be at this point in halfway. When I basically get to Devils, I better be at this sector time, or I better figure out a way to make up time. All of that didn't exist. So it was really trying to go off a seat of pants. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize about the race day is that there are those transit sections between section 1 and 2 in practice and section 2 and 3 in practice that drivers never see at speed until race day. So it poses a danger in being able to be smooth through those sections, but it also makes it difficult if you don't have years of experience at Pikes, like myself and some others, to try to gauge your understanding of, am I on record pace or not? Because those little transit sections you can never calculate for when you're doing practice. So yeah, it makes it kind of an interesting turn of events.
That's an interesting way to tune a car for the different sections of the mountain, because we did it through aerodynamics and suspension geometry passively. So at the low portion of the course, you have a lot of aero load, car sits lower, and the suspension geometry is what it is. And up top, it sits a little bit higher, and so you can kind of play with that in the Subarus. But you're actually playing with it through the torque vectoring, I guess you could say, and then also the bias of the regen, which has got to be pretty empowering to play with at Pikes Peak.
And it is, but it's also a double-edged sword, because regen is something that is unfortunately not 100% consistent in how it responds over state of charge. So when a vehicle is more charged, you're going to actually, even if you've asked for more regen, you're not going to get it. When it's a lower state of charge, if you've asked for more regen, you will get it. So you have a car that is dynamically changing in the same way that brake pads change over temperature and time. Your regen changes over temperature and time. So your driver techniques have to completely be altered from what a typical internal combustion would be, similar to how driving technique has to be completely altered when you're driving something with a lock center diff, or if you're driving a front wheel drive. When you're making a big vehicle dynamics based on its powertrain change, the driver must adjust to that. They can't just carry forward a winning skill set from something else they drove the year before, because it'll lead to disaster.
Wow, thank you. Great conversation. Catch us tomorrow on Hagerty's Daily Driver, but until then, keep driving. Hey! Hey! Hey guys!